She rode 3,000 miles to marry a man she had never seen. The letter had promised her a home. The letter had not told her there were 3 brothers waiting on that mountain. It had not told her about the woman buried behind the house, and it had not told her that within 6 weeks she would be riding alone through Devil's Pass in the dead of night with 12 hired guns climbing the back trail ahead of her, and the only man she had ever loved bleeding out on a porch she might not reach in time. This is the story of how Adelaide Ashford found her true home in the high country of Colorado, and it begins on a stagecoach on the 17th of September, 1883. The stagecoach groaned like a dying animal as it climbed the final switchback of Devil's Pass. Inside the cramped wooden box, Adelaide Ashford pressed her gloved palm against the window glass and watched the world fall away beneath her. Pine trees taller than any building she had ever seen in Boston stretched up toward a sky so wide and so blue it made her chest ache. She had read about the American West in her father's books. She had imagined it, but nothing in those leather-bound volumes had prepared her for the sheer terrifying scale of it. She was 23 years old. She had been traveling for 19 days, and she was about to meet the man who had paid $100 to make her his wife. The driver, a wiry old man named Pemberton, with a face like cracked saddle leather, pulled the team to a halt at the crest of the pass. He turned in his seat and rapped his knuckles against the wooden frame above her head. "Miss Ashford, need to water the horses. You best step out and stretch them legs of yours. We got another 4 hours to Cottonwood Falls." Della unlatched the door with trembling fingers. The mountain air struck her face like cold water. She had never smelled anything so clean in her entire life. Boston had always smelled of coal smoke and harbor rot and horse manure layered thick on cobblestones. This air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke and something wild she could not name. Pemberton helped her down with the gentleness an old man reserves for his own granddaughters. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in her dusty navy traveling dress, her honey blonde hair pinned beneath a small straw bonnet, the cameo brooch at her throat that had belonged to her mother. "Miss, may I speak plain?" "Of course. I've been driving this road 41 years. I drove the first stagecoach into Cottonwood Falls back in 42. I have carried gold prospectors and gunfighters and preachers and at least 100 mail-order brides going up to meet men they ain't never laid eyes on before." Della felt her heart begin to pound against her ribs. "And I want you to know something. You are the first cargo I have ever carried up to the Thornquist place." He paused. He studied her face the way a man studies the sky before a storm. "That letter you got in your reticule, the one you've been clutching like a Bible since Denver, it told you what you needed to hear to get on that train, but it did not tell you the whole truth, miss. Not by a long shot." Della looked down at her hand. She had not even realized she was holding the letter. Her knuckles were white around the folded paper. "What truth, Mr. Pemberton?" The old driver took off his hat. He rubbed the back of his sun-reddened neck. He looked away toward the western peaks where the snow line began. "That ain't my place to say, but you will know soon enough. Just remember this when you do. Up here in these mountains, a man's word is the only thing that lasts longer than the winter. And the Thornquist boys, for all the talk about them in town, they keep their word. That is more than I can say for most men I know." He climbed back up to his seat and gathered the reins. Della stood frozen in the road, the wind tugging at her bonnet, the unfolded letter trembling in her hand. She read the 3 lines again, the lines she had read 1,000 times since the envelope arrived in Boston 6 weeks ago. I will meet you at Cottonwood Falls on the 17th of September. Wear something easy to recognize. The road up the mountain is not an easy one. N. Thornquist. 3 lines, $100, a train ticket, and a promise of a home. She climbed back into the stagecoach. She did not cry. She had stopped crying somewhere outside St. Louis. There were no tears left in her, only a hard, quiet thing that had grown in her chest where her heart used to be. The wheels began to turn again. The pines closed in overhead. And somewhere ahead of her, 3 brothers were waiting on a mountain that did not yet know her name. Her mind drifted backward as the coach swayed and rocked, backward across the prairies and the rivers and the long, terrible months that had brought her to this road. Boston felt like a dream now, a dream she had survived rather than lived. Her father had been Cornelius Ashford, a professor of classical literature at Harvard College, a gentle man with ink-stained fingers and a soft voice who read Homer to her by the fire when she was 7 years old. Her mother had been Marigold Ashford, a woman of quiet beauty who played the piano so beautifully that grown men sometimes wept to hear her. Della had been their only daughter. There had been a brother once, but he had died in his first hour taking their mother with him into the dark. Della had been 12. After that, her father had become a ghost. He still taught his classes. He still read by the fire. But the music had gone out of him, and the house on Beacon Hill had grown cold and silent. He died of typhoid fever when she was 19. Della found him at his desk one morning, his head resting on a Latin manuscript, his pen still in his hand. The doctor said he had not suffered. Della knew better. He had been suffering since the day his wife died. Death had simply come at last to release him. The debts came next. The collectors, the lawyers in their black coats, who explained with great sympathy that her father's estate was insolvent. The house on Beacon Hill was sold. The piano her mother had played was sold. The library her father had built over 30 years was sold. By the end, Della had nothing but a small trunk of clothing, her grandmother's set of cooking knives, the cameo brooch, and a place to sleep in the attic of her Aunt Tabitha Ashford on Charles Street. Aunt Tabitha was a sharp-tongued woman who had never married and never forgiven the world for it. She made Della earn her keep as a tutor for the daughters of wealthy Beacon Hill families. Della taught French and Latin and piano and watched the fine young ladies of Boston grow into the kind of women she would never become. For 3 years she lived in her aunt's attic, 3 years of borrowed dresses and counted pennies and the slow erasure of every dream she had ever held. Then Aunt Tabitha died in her sleep one cold January night. The will was read. The house and everything in it went to a distant cousin in Philadelphia. Della was given 30 days to remove herself from the premises. She walked to St. Stephen's Church on the morning of the 29th day. She knelt in a back pew and she prayed, and she did not know what she was praying for. A miracle, a door, a way out. It was Sister Beatrix Holloway who found her there. The old nun with the kind blue eyes had known Della's mother once long ago, before either of them had taken their separate vows. Sister Beatrix sat down beside her in the pew and said nothing for a long time. Then she reached into the folds of her habit and pulled out a folded newspaper. "Child, I do not know if this is an answer or a curse, but it is a road, and you need a road." The newspaper was called the Matrimonial News. On page 4, circled in pencil, was an advertisement of 7 lines. Wanted, a respectable Christian woman of marriageable age, must be honest, hard-working, and not afraid of solitude. Mountain Ranch in Colorado Territory. $100 and stage fare provided upon agreement. Reply to N. Thornquist, General Delivery, Cottonwood Falls, Colorado. Della had read the advertisement 7 times before she folded the paper. Sister Beatrix had watched her in silence. Sister, I am afraid. Of course you are, child. Only fools are not afraid of the unknown. But fear is not the same thing as wrong. Sometimes the road God puts before us is the road we are most afraid to walk. She had written the letter that night. She had written it 3 times before she got the words right. 6 weeks later, a thick envelope had arrived at the convent, addressed to her in a hand, so plain and so firm that she had known immediately the man who wrote it was not given to wasted words. And now she was here, on a mountain road in Colorado, riding toward a man whose face she had never seen. The stagecoach lurched. Della was thrown against the window. Outside, the pine forest had given way to a long, sloping meadow, and below her in the valley she could see the rooftops of a town. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. A church steeple caught the afternoon sun. Cottonwood Falls. Her hand went to the cameo brooch at her throat. She took a breath. She straightened her back. Whatever was waiting for her down there, she would meet it the way her father had taught her to meet difficult things, with her chin lifted and her hand steady. The stagecoach rolled into Cottonwood Falls just past 3 in the afternoon. It was a rough little town of perhaps 200 souls, built mostly of unpainted lumber and false-fronted storefronts. There was a saloon called the Silver Dollar, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke, a small white church at the far end of the single dirt street, a telegraph office, a bank with a brass plate beside the door. Pemberton pulled the team to a stop in front of the stage office. He climbed down and helped Della out. He set her trunk on the boardwalk and tipped his hat to her. Miss Ashford, I wish you the best of luck, and I will say a prayer for you tonight. He climbed back up to his seat without waiting for an answer and clucked to the horses. Della watched the stagecoach disappear down the street in a cloud of red dust. Then she was alone. She stood on the boardwalk in her dusty navy dress. She had pinned a small white ribbon to her bodice as the letter had instructed. She watched the men of Cottonwood Falls move past her on their afternoon errands. A few of them tipped their hats. A few of them stared. None of them stopped. 2 hours passed. The sun moved lower. The shadows lengthened. The white ribbon on her dress felt suddenly absurd, a child's bow, worn by a grown woman who had been forgotten. She was beginning to feel the first cold edge of true panic when a man stepped out of the alley beside the saloon and walked toward her. He was a thick-shouldered man of perhaps 40, wearing a stained leather vest and a low-slung gun belt. His face was scarred along one cheek, the kind of scar that came from a knife rather than an honest accident. His eyes were small and dark, and they moved over her in a way that made her skin crawl. You the bride. Della took a half-step backward. Her hand closed instinctively around the handle of her trunk. I beg your pardon, sir. The Thornquist bride. From Boston. You wearing the white ribbon. He sent me to fetch you. Said he was held up. Come on now. Wagons around back. Something was wrong. Della could not have said what, but every nerve in her body was screaming at her to step away from this man. The letter had been very clear. N. Thornquist himself would meet her at Cottonwood Falls. The letter had not mentioned a man with a knife scar and a pistol on his hip. I am sorry, sir. I would prefer to wait for Mr. Thornquist himself. If you could perhaps show me a letter of introduction or some token from him. The scarred man's smile died. His hand moved toward her elbow. Lady, I said come on. Don't make me ask twice. And then she heard them, 3 sets of hooves coming down the street at a full gallop. The sound was like distant thunder rolling closer. Every head in Cottonwood Falls turned toward the noise. The scarred man's face went a shade paler. His hand fell away from her elbow as if it had been burned. Della turned. 3 riders were coming up the main street of Cottonwood Falls in a rolling cloud of dust. The man in the lead rode a black gelding the size of a small house. He wore a long oilskin coat, the color of dried blood, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. The man on his right rode a tall chestnut and carried a fiddle case strapped across his back. The man on his left rode a paint horse and had one hand resting on the butt of a Colt revolver, the other holding the reins easy as if he had been born on horseback. They reined in not 10 feet from the boardwalk where Della stood. A wall of dust rolled over her and settled. The man in the lead swung down from his saddle in one fluid motion that should have been impossible for a man of his size. His boots hit the boardwalk with a sound like a judge's gavel. He was the tallest man Della had ever seen, 6.5 feet at least, with shoulders as wide as a barn door, his face weathered by sun and wind and grief. His hair was dark brown, shot through with strands of gold from years under the western sky. His eyes were the color of whiskey, held up to firelight, and they were so cold they made her bones ache to look at them. He did not look at Della first. He looked at the scarred man. Bream, step away from her. The voice was low and quiet and absolutely without mercy. The scarred man Bream lifted both his hands away from his body and took 3 slow steps backward. Easy, Thornquist. I was just helping the lady. Stagecoach come in 2 hours ago. Nobody come to fetch her. I figured I would do a Christian act. The youngest of the 3 brothers, the one with the Colt revolver, swung down off the paint horse with a smile that had nothing to do with friendship. The smile was the smile of a wolf who has just found something interesting to play with. Bream, the last Christian act you done was the day your mother gave birth to you, and even she regretted it before sundown. Easy now, Rourke. The eldest brother lifted one hand. The youngest brother went still. The eldest brother turned his whiskey eyes on Bream and held him there, the way a hawk holds a rabbit before the strike. You are going to walk away now, Mordecai. You are going to walk away, and you are not going to look back, and you are not going to come within 50 yards of this woman ever again. Are we clear? Bream's mouth twitched. For one moment, Della thought he was going to reach for his gun. Then his hand fell to his side, and the moment passed. We are clear, Thornquist. But you tell your bride from Boston she ought to be careful up there on that mountain. Mr. Vexley has been asking after that land of yours, and Mr. Vexley does not like to be told no twice. He turned and walked back into the alley beside the saloon. He did not look back. The youngest brother watched him go with the wolf's smile still on his face. The middle brother, the one with the fiddle case, stepped down from his chestnut and came forward with a bow that would not have shamed a Boston gentleman. Miss Ashford, I am Ezra Thornquist. I apologize most sincerely that we were not here to meet your stage. Our cattle broke through a fence this morning at the high pasture, and we lost 3 hours rounding them up. It was unforgivable of us. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us anyway. Della almost wept at the gentleness in his voice. He had warm hazel eyes and a soft smile and the kind of long musician's hands that did not seem to belong on a mountain at all. I am Rourke, the youngest one. He did not bow. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse. He is thinking of buying, weighing her against the price. He did not seem impressed, but there was something else in his look too, something that might have been concern hidden so deep she almost missed it. The eldest brother had not yet spoken to her. Now he stepped forward and Della had to tilt her head back to look up into his face. Adelaide Ashford. It was not a question. He said her name as if he were testing the weight of it. Yes, sir. Are you N. Thornquist? Holden. My given name is Nathaniel Holden Thornquist. My mother named me Nathaniel before she died. Everyone in this country has called me Holden since I was a boy. The N in the letter was the name only my mother ever used. He looked down at her in silence for a long moment. She felt his eyes move across her face, across the dust on her dress, across the white ribbon on her bodice, and finally to the cameo brooch at her throat. Whatever he saw there, his expression did not change, but something in his shoulders seemed to ease just a fraction. Miss Ashford, there is something I have to tell you before we go any further, and I would rather tell it to you sitting down. He turned and lifted her trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He nodded toward a covered porch at the front of the stage office. There were 2 rough wooden benches there. He set the trunk down beside one of them and waited for her to sit. She sat. Her knees felt like water. He did not sit. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly between his fingers. His 2 brothers stood behind him, silent witnesses. Miss Ashford, I am going to be honest with you because you have come a very long way to hear honesty, and you deserve nothing less. My letter said that I needed a wife. That was true, but it did not tell you everything. He paused. He looked at his brothers. He looked back at her. 8 years ago, I was engaged to be married to a woman named Lenora Vance. She lived here in Cottonwood Falls. She was coming up the mountain to meet me one afternoon in October. Her wagon went over the edge at Devil's Pass. She did not survive. The wind stirred the dust on the street. Della did not move. I have not asked another woman for anything in 8 years, and I am not asking you for love now. I am asking you for help. My brothers and I live alone on a mountain 40 miles from this town. There is no woman in our house. There has not been a woman in our house since our mother died when we were boys. We need someone who can keep a home, someone who can read and write, someone who is not afraid of weather and silence and a long winter. I am offering you a place in my house. I am offering you my name if you want it and my protection if you do not. I will pay you a wage either way, and if at the end of 1 year you decide that this life is not for you, I will pay your fare back to Boston with another $100 besides. He stopped. He looked at the sky for a moment as if asking forgiveness for something. Then he looked back at her. That is the bargain, Miss Ashford. It is a poor bargain for a woman like you, but it is the only honest one I have to offer. If you want to take the next stagecoach back to Denver, I will not hold it against you. I will pay your way and call myself a fool for ever writing that letter. The silence that followed was the longest silence of Della Ashford's life. She heard a horse shifting its weight in the street. She heard a child laughing somewhere behind the general store. She heard her own heart beating in her ears. She thought of Boston. She thought of the empty pew at St. Stephen's where she had prayed for a road. She thought of Sister Beatrix saying that fear was not the same thing as wrong. She thought of her father dead at his desk with the pen still in his hand. She thought of her mother who had loved a quiet man and made him happy until the day she died. She thought of the white ribbon on her bodice and the $100 she had spent to come 3,000 miles to this exact spot on this exact afternoon. She looked up into the cold whiskey eyes of Holden Thornquist, And she saw what she had not seen at first. They were not cold at all. They were the eyes of a man who had built a wall of ice around something that was still burning underneath. "Mr. Thornquist, I will go with you up the mountain." He blinked. It was the first time she had seen him surprised by anything. "You are certain?" "I am certain. I did not come 3,000 miles to turn back at the last 40. For a long moment he did not speak. Then he nodded once very slowly and put his hat back on his head. "Then we ride. We will not make Thornquist Ridge before tomorrow afternoon. We will camp tonight at the old trapper's cabin halfway up. Ezra will drive the wagon with you. Rourke and I will ride flank. Are you ready, Miss Ashford?" "I am ready, Mr. Thornquist." He looked at her for one more heartbeat. Then he turned and walked to his black gelding and swung up into the saddle. The journey out of Cottonwood Falls began as the afternoon sun was sliding toward the western peaks. Ezra handed her up into the seat of a small canvas-covered supply wagon and clucked the team into motion. Holden rode ahead. Rourke rode behind. The town fell away. The pines closed in. The road climbed. For the first hour, Della did not speak. She was watching the country unroll around her, and she could not have made small talk if her life depended on it. The mountains were enormous. They rose on every side like the walls of some great cathedral, and the sky between them was the deepest blue she had ever seen. Aspens shivered in the wind, their leaves already turning gold. A red-tailed hawk circled high overhead. Once she saw a herd of mule deer break from the brush and bound up a rocky slope, and her breath caught in her throat at the wild beauty of them. Beside her on the wagon seat, Ezra Thornquist held the reins easy in his long hands and did not push her to talk. When she finally found her voice, it was to ask him a question. "Mr. Thornquist, has it always been only the three of you up here?" He looked at her with those warm hazel eyes. He took a long breath before he answered. "Our mother died when I was 8 years old. Holden was 11. Rourke was 5. She had pneumonia. It came on her in the middle of a hard winter, and there was no way to fetch a doctor. I was the one who was with her at the end. She asked me to sing to her, and I did. I was the last voice she heard." Della felt her eyes burn. She did not know what to say. "After that, I did not speak for 6 months. Not one word. Holden tried everything. So did our father. Nothing worked. And then one day our father put a fiddle in my hands. He had a fiddle of his own that his father had brought from County Cork in 1840. He showed me how to draw the bow across the strings. I think he believed that if I could not say words, I could at least make a sound, and it worked. The fiddle gave me back my voice. After a while, the words came too. Mr. Thornquist, that is a beautiful and a terrible story. Call me Ezra, miss. Up here we do not stand on ceremony, and I think a woman who has come 3,000 miles to share our roof has earned the right to use our given names. Then you must call me Della. Adelaide is what my father called me when he was being formal. Della is what my mother called me, and I prefer it." Ezra smiled. It was a small, sad, beautiful smile. "Della, welcome to Colorado." They rode on in silence for a while after that. The road grew steeper. Holden looked back over his shoulder every few minutes to check on her. Rourke rode silent behind the wagon, his eyes scanning the trees on either side of the road, as if he expected something to come bursting out at any moment. The sun was nearly down when they reached the trapper's cabin. It was a single-room shelter, built of squared logs and chinked with mud. There was a stone fireplace and a rough plank floor, and nothing else. Holden swung down from his saddle and pulled a heavy bundle from behind his cantle. He carried it inside and dropped it in the corner. Della, this will be your bed tonight. I am sorry, it is rough. We will be at the ridge by tomorrow afternoon, and you will sleep in a real bed then. He went out to tend the horses. Rourke built a fire in the ring of stones outside the cabin. Ezra unpacked a cast iron skillet and a slab of bacon and a sack of coffee from the wagon. Della stood watching them, feeling useless and out of place. Then she squared her shoulders and walked over to where Ezra was kneeling by the fire. Ezra, let me do that. Please, I would like to be useful. He looked up at her with surprise. Then he smiled and handed her the skillet. She had not cooked over an open fire in many years, but her grandmother had taught her how when she was a girl in Vermont, and her hands remembered. She set the skillet on the coals. She laid the bacon out in even strips. She fetched a tin can of beans from the wagon and set them in their own tin to warm at the edge of the fire. She found a small bag of cornmeal and a tin of bacon grease, and within 20 minutes she was dropping spoonfuls of fresh corn pone into the hot fat alongside the bacon. The smell of it brought all three brothers in like wolves to a kill. They sat around the fire on log rounds and ate from tin plates and did not speak for a long time. When Holden finally set down his plate, he looked across the fire at Della in a new way. Miss Ashford, where did you learn to cook? My grandmother. She had a farm in Vermont. I spent every summer with her until I was 12. She said that any woman who could not feed a man properly had no business calling herself a woman. A flicker of something crossed Holden's face. It might have been a smile if it had been allowed to grow. Your grandmother was a wise woman. After supper, Rourke pulled a harmonica out of his coat pocket and began to play a slow, mournful tune that Della did not recognize. Ezra unstrapped his fiddle from the saddle and joined in, and the two of them filled the mountain night with music that was older than any of them. Holden sat back against a fallen log with his arms folded across his chest and listened with his eyes closed. Della watched the firelight on the faces of these three strange men. She thought of her father reading Homer by the fire on Beacon Hill. She thought of how strange a thing a life could be, how a road could begin in one country and end in another, and how a woman could be reborn between dusk and dawn if she were brave enough to keep walking. When the music ended, Holden stood up and looked at her. Time to sleep, Miss Ashford. The cabin is yours. We will sleep out here by the fire. There is a bar across the inside of the door. Use it, not because there is anything to fear from us, because a woman should always have a door she can lock. She went inside. She barred the door behind her. She lay down on the rough bedroll and listened to the murmur of male voices outside and to the wind in the high pines and to her own slow heartbeat. She did not cry. She had stopped crying long ago. But she lay awake for a long time looking at the dark beams of the cabin roof, and she knew that her old life had ended somewhere on the road today, and she did not yet know what her new life was going to look like. Eventually, she slept. They were on the road again at first light. The morning was cold and silver, and the breath of the horses steamed in the air. The road climbed higher. They crossed a wooden bridge over a creek so clear Della could see the trout flickering beneath it. They passed a meadow where a bull elk lifted his great antlered head to watch them go by. They crossed a high saddle and came down into a wide valley, and there, at the head of the valley, framed by snow-capped peaks, Della saw it for the first time. Thornquist Ridge. It was not a cabin. It was a house. A great log house of 3 stories built of timbers as thick as a man's body, with a stone chimney rising from each end and a wide covered porch running the length of the front. There was a barn beside it, nearly as large as the house. There was a forge with smoke still drifting from its chimney. There was a corral where a dozen horses stood, watching the wagon come in. There were outbuildings and a smokehouse and a chicken coop, and beyond all of it, a long sweep of pasture where she could see cattle grazing all the way to the foot of the mountain. Ezra reined in the wagon at the top of the rise so she could look down on it. Our father built it, Augustus Thornquist. He came out from Pennsylvania in the year of 47 with one wagon and one mule and a wife. He cut every one of those logs himself. He raised the walls with his own 2 hands. He died in 1872, and we have kept it the way he left it as best we could. Della could not speak. She could only look. The house was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen built by human hands, and yet there was something about it that made her chest tighten. It looked lonely. It looked like a house that was waiting for something it had given up hope of receiving. They rolled down into the yard. Holden dismounted and helped her down from the wagon, and his hand under her elbow was the first time he had touched her. She felt the calluses on his palm. She felt the strength in his fingers. He let her go the moment her feet touched the ground. "Welcome to Thornquist Ridge, Miss Ashford." He carried her trunk up onto the porch and opened the front door and stepped aside for her to enter. Della walked in. She stopped 2 paces inside the door and stared. The house was a disaster. The great front room had a stone fireplace large enough to roast a whole hog and a long plank table that could have seated 12 men. But every surface was covered in dust. Saddle blankets had been thrown over chairs. A pair of muddy boots sat in the middle of the floor where someone had stepped out of them and walked away. The kitchen at the back of the house was worse. The great cast iron stove was caked in old grease. Dirty plates were stacked 3 deep in a wooden basin. A side of bacon hung from a beam over the table, and beneath it on the plank floor was a scatter of fallen crumbs that the mice had been at. Above the fireplace in the front room was a daguerreotype in a tarnished frame, and Della walked over to it almost without meaning to. It was a photograph of a young woman with dark hair pulled back from her face, holding 3 small boys in her lap. The oldest boy could not have been more than 11. The smallest could not have been more than 5. The woman was smiling at the camera with the gentle, tired smile of a mother who has given everything she has to give. Beside her, a little to the rear, stood a tall, bearded man with his hand resting on her shoulder. Della touched the frame with one fingertip. She did not realize that all 3 brothers were standing behind her watching her until she turned around. She set down her reticule. She untied her bonnet. She unpinned the white ribbon from her bodice. She rolled up her sleeves to the elbow. "Mr. Thornquist, I am going to need hot water, a great deal of it. I am going to need lye soap if you have any. I am going to need a broom and a bucket and several rags. And if any of you have a clean apron in this house, I would be most grateful for the loan of it." Holden Thornquist stared at her. The faintest ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Yes, Miss Ashford." He went to fetch the water himself. That night Holden led her up the broad pine staircase to a room on the 2nd floor at the front of the house. He opened the door and stood back to let her enter, and he watched her face very closely as she stepped inside. It was a woman's room, a small bed with a hand-quilted coverlet, a washstand of carved oak, a small mirrored vanity with a silver hairbrush still resting on it, a wardrobe in the corner, a braided rug on the wide plank floor, a single window looking out over the valley toward the snow-capped peaks. This was our mother's room. No one has slept in it since the day she died. I have kept it the way she left it. I do not know why. Maybe because I thought one day someone would need it again. He stood with his hat in his hands. He did not look at her. He looked at the silver hairbrush on the vanity. There is a bar across the inside of the door, Miss Ashford, the same as the cabin. Use it if it makes you feel safer. No one in this house will ever cross that threshold without your permission. That is my word, and my brothers will give you the same. She turned to thank him, but he was already going. He paused once at the doorway and looked back at her over his shoulder. I am glad you came, Della. Then he was gone, and his boots went down the stairs slowly, like a man bearing a great weight. Della closed the door. She did not bar it. She walked to the window and pushed open the shutters. The valley below her was already in shadow, but the high peaks to the west still caught the last red light of the sun. The wind moved through the pines outside her window and made a sound like a great breathing sea. She opened her trunk. She lifted out her grandmother's set of cooking knives, wrapped in oiled cloth, and set them on the small table by the window. She lifted out a folded piece of paper and a pencil, and she sat down on the edge of the bed to write a letter to Sister Beatrix Holloway in Boston. Dear sister, she wrote, I have arrived. The letter did not lie, but it did not tell me the whole truth either. There are 3 brothers here, not one. The eldest carries a sorrow in him that I think will take years to understand. The middle one plays the fiddle, and his hands are gentle. The youngest does not yet trust me, and I do not yet know why. The house is filthy, and the kitchen is a battlefield, and tomorrow I will begin the work of making it a home. I am tired, I am afraid, but I am here, and I am alive, and tonight, for the first time in many months, I am sleeping in a room that someone built for love instead of money. Pray for me, sister. I will write again when I can. Your faithful Della. She set the letter aside. She crossed to the window one last time before she undressed for bed. She looked down into the yard, and she froze. There was a man on the ridge across the valley. He was small with distance, but she could see him plainly in the last red light. He was sitting motionless on a horse, and he was holding something up to his face. A long brass tube, a spyglass. He was watching the house. He was watching her window. She knew before she even saw the scar that it was Mordecai Bream. She stood very still in the window. She did not move. She did not breathe. After a long moment, the man on the ridge lowered the spyglass and turned his horse and rode slowly away into the trees, and the last red light of the sun went out behind the mountains. Della closed the shutters. Her hands were trembling. She did not know yet about Thaddeus Vexley sitting in his railroad office in Denver, drafting a plan to send a forged telegram to a woman he had never met. She did not know about the false inheritance that would arrive on her doorstep within 6 weeks. She did not know that the storm coming down off the high peaks would nearly take Holden Thornquist's life, and that her own hands with her grandmother's needle and thread would be the only thing standing between him and the dark. She did not know that before the first snow of the season had fully passed, she would be riding alone through Devil's Pass in the dead of night, racing a column of hired guns up the mountain. She did not know any of that yet. She knew only that her old life had ended on the road from Cottonwood Falls. She knew only that there were 3 brothers asleep beneath her in this great quiet house, and that one of them had told her he was glad she came. She knew only that on the ridge across the valley, an enemy was watching her window in the dying light, and that she had walked eyes open into a story whose ending had not yet been written. She crossed the room to the small bed her mother-in-law had once slept in. She sat down on the edge of it. She put her hands in her lap, and she bowed her head, and she spoke her prayer the way her father had taught her to when she was a girl. Lord, make me equal to what is coming. Whatever it is, make me equal to it. She lay down. She pulled the old quilt up to her chin, and outside her window, the first night of the rest of her life began to fall over Thornquist Ridge. 6 weeks passed at Thornquist Ridge, and in those 6 weeks the great log house at the head of the valley began to remember what it had forgotten. The first morning had set the rhythm of all the mornings that followed. Della rose before the sun, just as she had risen in her grandmother's farmhouse in Vermont when she was a girl. She built up the fire in the great cast iron stove. With kindling she had split herself the night before. She set the coffee to boil. She rolled out biscuit dough on a board she had scrubbed white with lye and sand. She fried thick rashers of smokehouse bacon in the heavy iron skillet until the kitchen filled with a smell so rich and so warm that the 3 Thornquist brothers came down the staircase like men walking in a dream they did not want to wake from. They were quiet men, and they did not say much over the food, but Della watched their faces, and she saw what was happening. She saw Holden close his eyes for one moment over the first sip of coffee, the way a man closes his eyes over a memory he had thought lost forever. She saw Ezra reach for a second biscuit, and then a third, and she saw the small private smile he wore as he ate. She saw Rourke, the wild one, the one who had not yet learned to trust her, eat his portion in silence and then carry his own plate to the basin without being asked, which was the closest thing to a thank you that a man like Rourke knew how to offer. By the end of the first week, she had scrubbed every surface in the kitchen. By the end of the second week, she had taken down the curtains from the front room windows, washed them in a great copper boiler in the yard, and rehung them clean. By the end of the third week, she had found a forgotten room at the back of the house locked from the outside, and she had asked Holden very quietly if she might be allowed inside. Holden had stood looking at the door for a long time. Then he had taken a brass key from a hook above the mantel and unlocked the door himself, and he had stood back without a word and let her go in first. The room had been a parlor once. There was a small piano against the far wall, covered in a sheet that was thick with dust. There was a low table with a sewing basket on it, the spools of thread still arranged in the order their mother had left them on the day she died. There was a rocking chair by the cold fireplace. There was a vase of dried flowers, brittle as paper, that had been waiting 24 years for someone to throw them out. Della had not asked Holden any questions. She had only walked across the room and lifted the sheet from the piano with both hands, the way a woman lifts a shroud from the face of someone she loves. The piano was a small upright made of dark walnut, with brass fittings gone green from long neglect. She lifted the lid above the keys. She struck one note. The note was so far out of tune it made her wince, but it was a note, and the wires were not broken, and the soundboard was not cracked. That afternoon she went out to the forge and asked Ezra for the loan of a small wrench and a tuning hammer. Ezra had not asked her what she needed it for. He had simply made what she required and put it into her hands and watched her walk back into the house with the kind of careful, patient look that a man wears when he is afraid to hope. It took her 2 days to tune the piano. Her father had taught her how. She worked alone in the parlor with the door closed, and the brothers heard the long, slow creaking of strings being brought back to true, but none of them came to look. On the third day, in the late afternoon, when the slanted gold light of October was coming through the western windows, Della, sat down on the small piano stool. She rested her hands on the keys. She took a long breath, and then she began to play Beautiful Dreamer, the old Stephen Foster song her mother had played by the firelight in Boston when Della was a small girl. The first notes drifted out of the parlor and into the front room and out through the open kitchen door into the yard. Out by the corral, Holden Thornquist had been mending a length of leather harness. His hand stopped moving. He turned his head slowly toward the house, as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. The harness slid out of his fingers and onto the dust at his feet, and he did not bend to pick it up. Inside the forge, Ezra Thornquist had been hammering a horseshoe on the anvil. The hammer froze in midair. His face went white. He set the hammer down very carefully, as if it had become something fragile, and he walked out of the forge in his leather apron with the sweat still drying on his forehead. He crossed the yard and climbed the porch steps and stopped just inside the front room, and he stood there listening, with his eyes closed and his hands hanging at his sides. Their mother had played that song on that piano. He had not heard it in 24 years. When the last notes died away, Ezra turned and walked silently back out to the forge. He did not trust himself to speak, but that night after supper, when Della was clearing the table, he came up beside her and pressed something into her hand. It was a small bundle wrapped in clean linen. She unwrapped it after she went up to her room. Inside was a thin silver chain with a tiny silver music note hanging from it. He had made it himself in the forge, hammered out of a Mexican silver coin with a craftsmanship so fine it made her draw in her breath. There was no note. There did not need to be one. The youngest brother, Rourke, was harder. He had not spoken to her more than 10 words in the first 3 weeks. He came in for his meals. He ate. He thanked her with a short nod. He went back out. He spent his days in the saddle riding the high pastures, hunting in the deep pine brakes above the house, coming back at dusk with a buck slung across his horse or a string of grouse hanging from his belt. He slept in a small bunk room off the kitchen, the smallest of the 3 brothers' rooms, and his door was always closed. Della watched him. She did not push. She had been raised by a sharp-tongued aunt, and she knew that some men were like wild horses in a corral. You did not chase them. You let them come to you in their own time. In the 4th week, she asked Ezra a careful question. Ezra, was there a meal your mother used to make that Rourke loved, especially something he has not tasted in many years? Ezra looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup for a long moment. Venison pie with wild onion and a thick crust. Mama made it on his birthday every year. After she died, no one ever made it again. He has not eaten venison pie in 24 years. The next afternoon, when Rourke rode down out of the high country and unsaddled his horse and walked into the kitchen for his supper, he stopped 2 steps inside the door and went very still. The smell hit him first. The smell of venison stewed slow with wild onion and pepper and a splash of red wine from a bottle Della had found in the back of the pantry. The smell of a thick golden crust baked to flaking perfection in the great cast iron oven. The smell of his mother's hands and his mother's apron in a kitchen that had not existed for him in 24 years. Rourke Thornquist did not move. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his hair full of pine needles and his eyes very far away. Della set the pie on the long plank table and cut him a piece and slid it onto a plate and laid the plate at his usual chair without a word. Then she stepped back and went on with her work as if nothing unusual were happening. He came forward slowly and sat down. He cut a small piece with his fork. He brought it to his mouth. He chewed once. He chewed twice. He set the fork down and put both his hands flat on the table and bowed his head, and his shoulders shook one time, just one time, and then he was still. When he raised his head again, his eyes were bright. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the grain of the wood under his hands. "Miss Ashford, you did not have to do this. I know I did not have to. But you deserved a piece of your mother's pie, Mr. Thornquist. Every man does." He ate the entire piece in silence. Then he ate a second. Then he stood up and walked out into the yard, and he stood under the porch eaves with his back to the house for a long time. When he came back inside, he walked over to where she was kneading bread for the morning, and he set something down on the corner of the work table. It was a small knife with a handle of polished elk antler, the blade as keen as a razor. "I made it last winter, for myself. I want you to have it." "Mr. Thornquist?" "Rourke. My name is Rourke, and the knife is yours, ma'am. A woman who can cook the way you cook ought to have a proper blade." He walked away before she could answer, but that night at supper, she saw him watching her across the table, and the look in his eyes was no longer the look of a wolf weighing a stranger. It was something quieter, something like the beginning of trust. The middle weeks of October brought the first hard frost. The aspens on the lower slopes turned the color of beaten copper. The mornings came in with a bite in the air that promised real winter was not far away. Della took to wearing a heavy wool shawl over her shoulders when she went out to the chicken coop in the gray dawn light, and her breath made a small white cloud in front of her face. It was during this time that old Hessie McBride came to call. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a small cart pulled by a swayback gray mule. She was a woman of perhaps 70 years, broad in the shoulders and broad in the hips, with hair as white as a fresh snowfall and eyes the gray color of a winter sky. She wore a long brown wool dress and a man's leather coat, and she walked with a stout hickory stick. Her voice when she spoke had the soft burr of the Appalachian hill country, where she had been born 7 decades ago to a Scottish father and an Irish mother. She had come, she said, to bring a basket of fresh eggs and to take the measure of the woman from Boston who had moved into the house she had cleaned and cooked in for nearly 24 years after the boy's mother had passed. Della made tea. Hessie sat at the long plank table and watched Della with eyes that missed nothing. They talked of small things at first, the weather, the cattle, the early frost. Then Hessie set down her teacup and folded her work-worn hands in front of her. "Child, I am going to ask you something now, and I want you to answer me honest. Do you know about Lenora Vance?" Della felt the bottom go out of her stomach. "Holden told me. He told me on the very first day. He said she died in a wagon accident at Devil's Pass 8 years ago. He said he had been engaged to marry her." Hessie nodded slowly. "That is true, so far as it goes, but it is not the whole story, child, not by half, and I'm going to tell you the whole story now because you are living in this house and you cannot help that man heal a wound you cannot see." She took a long breath. Lenora Vance was a good woman, a school teacher in Cottonwood Falls. She loved Holden Thornquist with the kind of love that comes once in a life, if it comes at all. They were to be married in November of 1875. On the afternoon of the 17th of October, she set out from town to come up the mountain to spend a few days at the ridge. Holden was supposed to ride down and meet her at the Devil's Pass turnout, but that morning his neighbor, old Henry Clayton, came riding up here in a panic. Henry's wife had gone into labor 3 weeks early, and there was no one to help her, and Henry begged Holden to come back down with him and fetch the midwife from town. Hesse's eyes were very steady on Della's face. Holden went. He saved Henry Clayton's wife and her baby that day. Both of them are alive in Cottonwood Falls right now because of him. But he was not at Devil's Pass when Lenora's wagon came over the edge. The driver had been drinking. He took the turn too fast. The wagon went off the ledge. Lenora died on the rocks below. Della pressed her hand against her mouth. Holden found her himself. He had ridden up the road to meet her after he settled the midwife at Henry's place. He carried her body back up the mountain alone. He buried her beside his mother in the little graveyard on the rise behind the house. And then he closed the door on his own heart, and he locked it, and he threw the key into a place no one has been able to reach for 8 long years. Hesse reached across the table and took Della's hand in her own. Child, he thinks he killed her by being where he was supposed to be a hero. He has spent 8 years punishing himself for saving the wrong life. That is the wound you are dealing with. That is the man you are trying to feed back to life with your biscuits and your piano playing and your venison pie. Hesse squeezed her hand once and let it go. I am telling you this because you are good for him. I see it on his face when he looks at you, and the boy has not had that look on his face in 8 years. But you cannot heal him with bread alone. You will need to be patient, and you will need to be brave. And one day, if God is kind, you will need to be there when he is finally ready to set down the key. Della could not speak for a long moment. When she could finally find her voice, it was barely a whisper. Hesse, why are you telling me this? Why now? The old woman looked toward the window. Her gray eyes went distant. Because there is a storm coming, child. I can feel it in my bones. And I do not mean only the storm that is coming down off the high peaks before the week is out. I mean another kind of storm too, a storm with a man's face on it. Mr. Thaddeus Vexley has been making inquiries in town. He wants this land, and men like Vexley do not stop until they get what they want or until somebody stops them. You need to know what kind of man you are standing beside, because before this winter is out, you may have to stand beside him in earnest. She gathered her shawl and her stick and rose from the table. At the door she paused and looked back. One more thing, child. Holden's mother and I were like sisters once. I was with her at the end just as Ezra was. Before she died, she told me something. She made me promise. She said, Hesse, if a woman ever comes into this house with kindness in her hands, you tell her she is welcome. You tell her this house has been waiting for her. You tell her my boys have been waiting too, even if they do not know it yet. The old woman's gray eyes filled with tears she would not let fall. Welcome to Thornquist Ridge, Adelaide Ashford. The house has been waiting. She went out. The door closed behind her. Della stood alone in the kitchen with her hand still warm where Hesse had held it, and she did not move for a very long time. That same afternoon, Thaddeus Vexley came up the mountain. He arrived in a polished black surrey, pulled by 2 matched bay horses, with 2 men on horseback riding behind him. He wore a black broadcloth suit and a silk waistcoat and a gold watch chain heavy enough to anchor a small boat. His hair was iron gray and oiled flat against his skull. His eyes were the color of wet slate, and they smiled when his mouth did not. Holden met him in the yard. Della watched from the front window with her hands twisting in her apron. Ezra came out of the forge, wiping his hands on a rag. Rourke materialized from somewhere near the corral with his rifle hanging easy in the crook of his arm. The conversation in the yard was brief. Della could not hear most of it through the glass, but she heard Vexley's voice rise once. $5,000, Mr. Thornquist. $5,000 in gold coin paid into your hand on this very porch tomorrow morning. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad will lay its new spur through this valley with or without your cooperation. I am simply offering you the chance to be paid handsomely for what is going to happen anyway. Holden's reply was so quiet she could not hear the words, but she saw Vexley's face change. The smile in his eyes flickered out. Mr. Thornquist, I am a patient man, but my patience has a limit, and so does the patience of the men who employ me. I will give you 30 days to reconsider. After that, I am afraid things will become considerably more difficult for you and your brothers, and for the lady who I understand has recently joined your household. Vexley turned his head and looked directly at the front window of the house. He looked directly at Della. He smiled. He tipped his hat to her through the glass. Then he climbed back into his surrey, and his men turned their horses, and the whole party went rolling slowly back down the road toward Cottonwood Falls. Holden stood alone in the yard for a long time after they were gone. When he finally came back into the house, his face was the color of cold iron. He walked past Della without speaking and went into his small office at the back of the front room and closed the door. She gave him an hour. Then she made a fresh pot of coffee and poured a cup and carried it back to the office and knocked once on the door. He opened it. He looked at her. He looked at the coffee in her hands. Something in his face cracked very slightly and then closed again. Come in, Della. Sit down. She set the cup on his desk and sat across from him in the small wooden chair. Holden, I am not afraid of him. I want you to know that. Whatever he means to do, I am not afraid. He looked at her for a long moment. He picked up the coffee cup. He held it between his big, calloused hands, as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. You should be afraid of him, Della. He is a dangerous man, but I am glad you are not. He set the cup down. He looked toward the window where the afternoon was already starting to fade. There is a storm coming in tomorrow night or the next morning. Rourke can read the sky better than any man I know, and he says it will be a bad one. We need to bring the cattle down from the high pasture before it hits. The 3 of us will be gone tomorrow at first light. We may not be back for 2 days. You will have the house to yourself. I am asking you to bar every door and every window when we leave, and not to open them for any man until you hear my voice on the porch. Will you do that for me? I will do it. Good. He stood up. She stood up. For one heartbeat, they were standing very close in the small office, and the lamplight on his face showed her the lines that the last 8 years had cut into him, and she felt something move inside her chest that she had not felt since she was a girl. Then he stepped back, and the moment was over. The brothers rode out at gray dawn the next morning. Della stood on the front porch in her shawl and watched them go. The sky to the west was already the color of old lead. The wind had a sharp tooth in it. Holden looked back over his shoulder one time as he reached the bend in the road. He raised one gloved hand. She raised her own in answer. Then he was gone. The first snowflakes began to fall by mid-morning. By noon, they were falling thick. By the middle of the afternoon, the storm had become a true blizzard, the kind of wind-driven, white, howling violence that mountain people respected and feared. Della kept the great fireplace in the front room piled high with split pine. She kept the kitchen stove roaring. She brought all the chickens inside the woodshed and shut the milk cow up tight in the barn with extra hay. She did everything she could think to do, and then she sat down by the front window and she watched the snow come down across the valley, and she prayed. Night fell. The storm did not slacken. It grew worse. It was some time past midnight when she heard the pounding on the door. She was already half running across the front room before she realized she had left her chair. The pounding was frantic, the kind of pounding a man makes when there is no time left for politeness. She threw the bar back. She pulled the door open against a blast of wind and snow. Rourke half fell into the room. His coat was caked white. His face was the color of bone. His left hand was wrapped around his right wrist, and his right hand was dark with frozen blood. Della, Holden. He is hurt, bad. A bull went mad in the snow and put a horn through his thigh. Ezra is bringing him down on a travois behind his horse. They are still a mile out. I rode ahead. Della listened to me. The doctor in Cottonwood Falls is 40 miles away on a clear day. In this storm, he might as well be on the moon. You are the only one who can do this. Do you understand me? She was already moving. Yes, I understand. Get the kitchen table cleared. Move the lamp over. Bring every clean cloth in the house. There are bed sheets in the linen press at the top of the stairs. Bring all of them. And boil water, as much as you can. Now, Rourke, now. She ran upstairs and ripped open her trunk. Her grandmother's set of cooking knives, a small bone needle she used for mending, the spool of strong silk thread she had brought from Boston for embroidering collars, a tiny pair of scissors. She gathered everything into her apron, and she ran back down. In the kitchen, Rourke had cleared the long plank table. The lamps were all lit. The water was already steaming in the great copper kettle on the stove. A stack of clean white bed sheets sat on the chair. Della tore one of the sheets into long strips with her hands. She poured boiling water into a basin and dropped her needle and her thread and her scissors into it. She poured a measure of whiskey from the bottle in Holden's office over her own hands and over the blade of her smallest knife. She did not let her hands shake. She would not allow it. The front door crashed open. Ezra came staggering in with Holden, half across his shoulder, half dragging behind him. The two of them were a single white snow-caked figure in the lamplight, and the floor behind them was streaked with red. Get him on the table. Rourke take his shoulders, Ezra his legs. Easy now, easy. They laid him on the long plank table. His face was as white as the snow in his hair. His eyes were closed. The denim of his right trouser leg was black and stiff with frozen blood from the hip nearly to the knee. Della took her smallest knife and slit the trouser open from the cuff to the waist with one long, careful cut. The wound underneath made her catch her breath. The bull's horn had driven into the outside of his thigh and torn upward, opening a gash as long as her hand and deep enough to show the white of muscle beneath. The blood was coming slow now because of the cold and the loss, but it was still coming, and she knew that if she could not close it, he would not live to see another sunrise. She did not let herself think about the man on the table. She let herself think only about the wound. She had watched her grandmother sew up a horse one summer in Vermont when she was 9 years old. She had watched her father once stitch the paw of a stray dog. The principle was the same. Skin was skin. Thread was thread. A steady hand was a steady hand. She washed the wound with hot water and whiskey. Holden moaned once but did not wake. She pressed a clean, folded cloth into the deepest part of the gash to stop the worst of the bleeding while she threaded her needle. Her fingers did not tremble. Her breathing was slow and even. She began to sew. She sewed the way her grandmother had taught her to embroider when she was a girl, with small, even stitches, each one careful and tight. She worked from the deepest end of the wound outward. The needle slid through the torn flesh as cleanly as it had ever slid through linen. Holden did not move. Once somewhere near the middle of the work his eyes flickered open. He looked up at the lamplight on the ceiling, and then his eyes traveled slowly down to her bent face, and they stayed there. He did not speak. He only watched her. She stitched for nearly an hour. When the last stitch was tied off, she packed the closed wound with a poultice of sugar and clean linen, the way her grandmother had taught her to dress, a deep cut, and she bandaged the whole leg with the long strips of bedsheet from cuff to hip. When she was done, she stepped back from the table. Her hands were red to the wrist. Her apron was ruined. Her hair was coming down around her face. She looked across the table at Holden Thornquist. He was looking at her with whiskey eyes that were no longer cold at all. He raised his right hand off the table. It took him a great effort to do it. He held the hand out to her palm, up. She put her own hand into it. Della, you have healed the first thing in this house in 8 years. His eyes closed. His hand went slack in hers, but he was still breathing, and his breathing was strong, and she knew then that he would live. She bowed her head over their joined hands, and she wept for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach in Cottonwood Falls. Outside the kitchen window, the storm went on howling, but inside the great log house at Thornquist Ridge, something that had been frozen for 8 years had begun very slowly to thaw. 3 nights later, when Holden was strong enough to sit up against a pillow in his bed, he asked her to come and read to him from a book of poems Ezra had brought down from his library. She read to him for an hour. When she rose to go, he caught her wrist in his big bandaged hand, and he held her there very gently, and he looked up at her with eyes she had never seen before. Della, there is something I want you to know. I do not want anything from you that you are not ready to give. I will never ask. I will only wait. But I want you to know that the man who answered your letter is not the same man who is lying in this bed tonight. I do not know what I am yet. I only know that I am no longer what I was. She sat back down on the edge of the bed. She put her hand against the side of his face. He closed his eyes and turned his cheek into her palm, like a man who has been thirsty for a very long time. Holden Thornquist, I am not in any hurry. I have walked a very long road to get to this room. I am content to sit in it for a while. He smiled. It was the first true smile she had ever seen on his face, and it changed him so completely that she almost did not recognize him. She read to him until he fell asleep. Then she laid the book on the nightstand, and she went out and closed the door very softly behind her. She did not know that Thaddeus Vexley was already drafting a forged telegram at his desk in Denver, a telegram that would arrive at Thornquist Ridge within days and force her to make the hardest choice of her life. She did not know that within 2 weeks she would be riding alone through Devil's Pass in the dead of night, racing a column of hired guns up the mountain to save the man whose wound her hands had just closed. She knew only that the worst night of the season was behind her, and that the man she had ridden 3,000 miles to meet had finally at long last looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. The wind was dying outside the windows of Thornquist Ridge. The first thin gray light of morning was beginning to show above the eastern peaks, and down in the kitchen, the great cast iron stove was still warm from the night's long fight, waiting patiently for her to come back and build the fire up again for breakfast. The morning after the storm broke clean and silent over Thornquist Ridge, the world was a single white sheet of new fallen snow, and the sky above the high peaks was the deepest blue Della had ever seen. She stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee warming her hands and watched the sun climb slowly over the eastern ridge and turn the snow on the meadow into a field of cold fire. Holden was sleeping upstairs. Ezra was out in the forge banking the coals. Rourke was checking the cattle in the lower pasture. The house was quiet around her in the way that only a mountain house can be quiet, with the small sounds of a fire settling, and a pot ticking on the stove, and a single chickadee calling from the eaves outside the window. She did not yet know that this morning would be the last quiet morning she would have for many days. It was Reverend Obadiah Stoneley who brought the telegram up the mountain himself. He arrived just before noon on a tired bay mare, his black coat dusted white with snow from the long ride up from Cottonwood Falls. He was a small, spare man of perhaps 60, with a white beard and pale blue eyes, and the gentle, worn-out face of a country preacher who had buried too many people in his life. He had been the man who had buried Lenora Vance 8 years ago. He had been the man who had baptized Rourke Thornquist when Rourke was 3 weeks old. There was no man in the territory whom the Thornquist brothers trusted more. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee with hands that trembled faintly from the cold. He pulled a folded yellow telegram from inside his coat and laid it on the wood between them. Miss Ashford, this came into the wire office in Cottonwood Falls yesterday afternoon. It is addressed to you. The wire operator brought it to me because he did not know where you might be staying, and he thought I might be able to find you. I rode out with it as soon as I heard about the storm passing. I am sorry I could not come sooner. Della unfolded the telegram with fingers that had gone suddenly cold. To Miss Adelaide Ashford, father's estate found in Boston probate, inheritance pending. Mr. Percival Hollister of Crowley and Sons law firm arriving Cottonwood Falls, November 30th to escort you home. Estate value $40,000. Return immediately. Crowley and Sons. She read it twice, then a third time. The room around her seemed to tilt very slowly, as if the floor of the house had become the deck of a ship. $40,000. It was a fortune larger than anything her father had ever owned in his life. It was enough money to buy a townhouse on Beacon Hill, to keep a carriage and a cook and a maid, to live as a lady of independent means until the day she died. It was the answer to every prayer she had whispered into the dark of her aunt's attic for 3 long years, and it had come 6 weeks too late. Reverend Stoneley watched her face. He did not press her. When she finally lifted her eyes from the paper, his pale blue gaze was full of a quiet sympathy. "Child, I do not know what is in that wire. I did not read it, but I can see by your face that it is not a small thing. If you wish to ride back down the mountain with me this afternoon, I will see you safely to town." Della folded the telegram with great care and slid it into the pocket of her apron. "Reverend, I need to think. I need to speak with Mr. Thornquist. May I ask you to stay the night? I will give you a hot supper and a warm bed, and we can ride down together in the morning if I decide to go." "Of course, child, of course." She took the stairs slowly. Her feet felt as if they belonged to someone else. She paused outside Holden's bedroom door for a long moment, listening for any sound, and then she knocked. He was awake. He was sitting up against 3 pillows, his bandaged leg stretched out before him, a book of his father's old almanacs open on his lap. He looked up at her face the moment she stepped inside, and whatever he saw there made him close the book and set it aside without a word. "Come and sit down, Della." She sat on the edge of the bed. She took the telegram out of her apron pocket and laid it in his hand. He read it. His face did not change. He read it a second time, more slowly. Then he folded it and laid it on the nightstand beside the bed and looked toward the window for a long, long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Della, you have to go." "Holden, no, listen to me. This is not a small thing. This is your father's name. This is the work he did before he died. $40,000 is a life. It is a life back in the city you came from, with people who knew your mother and your father and the world you grew up in. I cannot ask you to set that aside for a wounded man on a mountain in Colorado. I will not ask it. I would never forgive myself if I asked it. You are asking me to leave. I am giving you the right to choose. There is a difference." She looked down at her hands folded in her lap. She thought about her father. She thought about the pen still in his hand on the morning she had found him at his desk. She thought about Beacon Hill and the empty pew at St. Stephen's and the way Boston had smelled of coal smoke and harbor rot. She thought about her grandmother in Vermont, teaching her to roll out biscuit dough on a board scrubbed white with sand. She thought about a man in a black Surrey tipping his hat to her through a window glass and smiling with eyes that did not smile. She thought about the look on Holden Thornquist's face when she had finished sewing his leg 3 nights ago. "Holden, I will not give you my answer today. I will give it to you in Cottonwood Falls." He nodded once. His jaw was very tight. "Take the morning. I will have Ezra hitch the wagon. Reverend Stoneley will see you safely down." She rose to leave. At the doorway, she stopped and looked back at him. He was looking at the window again, and the gray afternoon light fell across his face and showed her every line of the 8 years he had spent locked behind a door of his own making. "Holden, whatever I decide, I want you to know one thing. You did not ask me to leave because you wanted me gone. You asked me to leave because you were afraid to ask me to stay. There is a difference, and I see it." He did not turn his head, but his hand on the bedclothes closed slowly into a fist. She closed the door very softly behind her. She did not sleep that night. She sat up by the window of her mother-in-law's room with a single candle burning, and she wrote 3 letters, one to Sister Beatrix Holloway in Boston, one to her father, a letter she would never send because the man was 8 years dead, but a letter she needed to write all the same, and one to herself on the back page of her small leather diary in which she set down all the things she had learned in the 6 weeks since she had stepped off the stagecoach in Cottonwood Falls. She read the letter to herself 3 times before she blew out the candle. It was Ezra who came to her in the gray hour before dawn. He knocked once very softly, and she opened the door to find him standing in the hall in his shirt sleeves with something in his hand. It was a small leather-bound book worn at the corners, the cover cracked with age. "Della, I want you to take this with you on the road today. I want you to read the last page before you reach Cottonwood Falls." "What is it?" "It is our mother's journal. She kept it the last 2 years of her life. I have kept it in a wooden box under my bed for 24 years. None of my brothers know I have it, not even Holden. I have read it perhaps 100 times. The last page is the most important. Promise me you will read it before you give your answer." She took the book from his hands. "I promise." He nodded. He turned to go. Then he stopped and looked back at her. "Della, I am not asking you to stay for me. I am asking you to stay for him. He has been dying very slowly for 8 years, and you are the only thing I have ever seen that has made him want to live again. Do not let him be a fool a second time. Please." He walked back down the hallway in his sock feet and disappeared into the dark. The wagon left Thornquist Ridge in the cold blue light of dawn. Reverend Stoneley drove the team. Della sat beside him with her trunk in the back and her grandmother's cooking knives wrapped in oiled cloth across her lap. She did not look back at the house. She knew that if she looked back even once, she would not be able to leave at all. Holden had come to the front porch in his nightshirt and a heavy wool blanket, leaning hard on a crutch Ezra had carved for him from a cottonwood limb. He had not said goodbye to her. He had only stood there in the gray dawn with the blanket pulled tight around his shoulders and watched the wagon roll out of the yard. The last thing she had seen as the road bent away into the pines was his tall figure on the porch, motionless like a man carved out of the dawn itself. The road down to Cottonwood Falls took the better part of the day. They reached the town just as the sun was beginning to slide toward the western peaks. Reverend Stoneley brought her to the small, clean rooming house that the widow Margaret Hollins ran on the back street behind the church, and he saw her settled into a small upstairs room with a window that looked out over the false-fronted street. Mr. Hollister will be at the Silver Dollar Saloon in the morning, child. He came up early. The wire operator told me he stepped off the 11 o'clock stage 2 days ago and has been waiting at the hotel ever since. I will come for you at 9 o'clock if you wish, or I will not come at all if you tell me not to. Whichever you decide, I will respect it. He pressed her hand once and went out and closed the door behind him. Della sat down on the narrow bed. She pulled Ezra's mother's journal out of her bag and held it in her lap for a long time before she opened it. She turned to the last page. The handwriting was small and neat and formed by a woman who had been taught to write by a stern New England schoolmistress many years before. The ink was faded but still legible. The date at the top of the page was March the 11th, 1859, 2 days before the woman who had written it had died of pneumonia in the small bedroom on the second floor of the great log house at Thornquist Ridge. To my 3 boys, Nathaniel and Ezra and Rourke. If you are reading this, then I am gone. I do not know which of you will find this journal. I do not know how old you will be when you find it. I only know what I want to tell you. Do not let love pass you by because you are afraid. Fear of loss is the smallest reason in the world to refuse love. I have been afraid every day of my life. I have been afraid of the cold and the wolves and the long winters. I have been afraid for your father riding alone in the high country. I have been afraid of the day I would have to leave the 3 of you behind, and now that day is here, and I find that even this is not the worst thing I could have imagined. The worst thing would have been to have lived without your father. The worst thing would have been to have refused him when he asked me to come west with him in the spring of '47, when I was a girl of 19 with all of Pennsylvania at my back, and a strange, tall stranger from a different world standing in front of me. The worst thing would have been to have said no to love because I was afraid of losing it. I would not trade 1 single day with your father for 1,000 years of safety in my mother's house in Lancaster. So this is my only blessing for the 3 of you. Find women who fill your house with light. Let them love you. Love them back without holding any of yourselves in reserve. The world will take what it takes from you no matter what you do. The only thing you can choose is whether to live with your hands open or your hands closed. Live with your hands open. Live with your hands open even when it costs you everything. That is the only counsel I have left to give. Your loving mother, Eleanor Thornquist. Della closed the book very slowly. She sat with it in her lap in the small upstairs room of Mrs. Hollins's rooming house, and she did not move for a long time. It was at that exact moment that she heard the boots in the hallway outside her door. The knock, when it came, was not the soft, polite knock of Reverend Stoneleigh. It was a slow, deliberate knock made by a man who had come to deliver a message. Della rose from the bed and went to the door and opened it without thinking, and she found herself looking up into the wet slate eyes of Thaddeus Vexley. He was smiling. He took off his hat with elaborate courtesy and bowed. "Miss Ashford, forgive the intrusion. I happened to be in town on business, and I heard from a most reliable source that you had arrived this afternoon. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." She did not invite him in. He came in anyway. He set his hat on the small table by the window and turned to face her with the smile still on his lips and nothing at all behind it. "I will be brief, Miss Ashford. I know about the telegram you received yesterday. I know about the inheritance. I know about Mr. Percival Hollister, who is at this moment sitting in the Silver Dollar Saloon, waiting to escort you back to Boston in the morning. I know all of these things because I arranged every one of them." The room went very quiet. Della felt the floor shift beneath her again, the way it had shifted in the kitchen at Thornquist Ridge yesterday afternoon. "There is no inheritance, Miss Ashford. Your father's estate is exactly what the lawyers told you it was 3 years ago. Insolvent. The telegram is a forgery. Mr. Hollister is not a lawyer. He is a confidence man from Chicago who I have employed for similar errands many times before. The $40,000 does not exist. None of it exists." She could not speak. She could only stare at him. "Now, before you become unduly upset, let me explain what is actually being offered. I will pay you $5,000 in gold coin in this room tonight in exchange for a single thing. You will board the morning stage to Denver with Mr. Hollister, and you will not return to Thornquist Ridge. Not now, not ever. You will write Holden Thornquist a letter from Denver telling him that you have decided to return to Boston after all. You will sign it in your own hand, and then you will be free to do whatever you wish with $5,000 of real American gold." He set a heavy leather pouch on the small table beside his hat. The pouch made a soft, dense sound when it touched the wood, the sound of a great deal of metal. "That is a year's wages for 10 honest men, Miss Ashford. It is more than enough to start a new life anywhere in this country. San Francisco, New Orleans, or back to Boston in style. The choice is yours." She found her voice at last. It was very small, but it did not shake. "Why do you want me gone, Mr. Vexley?" He smiled the smile that did not touch his eyes. "Because Holden Thornquist will not sell me his land, and as long as you are sitting in his house cooking his suppers and tuning his mother's piano, he will have a reason to keep refusing me. If you are gone, he will have nothing left up there but ghosts, and eventually the ghosts will wear him down and he will sell. It is simple business, Miss Ashford. There is nothing personal in it." She looked at the pouch on the table. She looked at the man's face. She thought about the last page of Eleanor Thornquist's journal. "Mr. Vexley, what happens if I refuse?" His smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "That would be regrettable, Miss Ashford, truly regrettable. I told Mr. Thornquist 6 weeks ago that I would give him 30 days to reconsider my offer. I lied to him. I have never given any man 30 days who I did not need to, because in that event I am afraid I would be obliged to give an instruction to 12 men I have already hired and quartered at a camp 7 miles from Thornquist Ridge. The instruction would be to ride up the mountain at first light tomorrow and burn the great log house to the ground. The Thornquist brothers would be given the opportunity to leave on their own feet, or not. That choice would be theirs, but the house would burn, and so would the barn, and so would every fence and every outbuilding and every standing structure on the property. By tomorrow night, there would be nothing left on Thornquist Ridge but a chimney standing in a black field of ash, and the railroad would have its valley by Christmas. Della stood very still. She felt her heart beating against her ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm she had never felt before in her life. It was not the rhythm of fear. It was something much colder and much steadier than fear. I see. I am glad you see. Take your time. I will return at midnight for your answer. The pouch will stay here on the table. It is yours either way as a token of my respect for your position. I am not an unkind man, Miss Ashford. Whatever you decide tonight, I want you to remember that. He picked up his hat. He bowed again. He walked out of the room and closed the door very softly behind him, and his boots went down the stairs with the same slow, deliberate rhythm with which they had come up. Della stood alone in the small room for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she moved. She did not take the pouch of gold. She left it sitting on the table where Vexley had set it. She wrote a single line on a sheet of Mrs. Hollins's writing paper and laid it on top of the pouch. The line read, "I have chosen my true home. Tell Mr. Vexley that I will fight." She put on her coat and her bonnet. She buckled the small elk antler knife Rourke had given her into the sash at her waist beneath her coat where it would not show. She picked up Ezra's mother's journal and put it into her bag. She went down the back stairs of the rooming house and out into the cold blue dusk of the November evening, and she walked straight to the small parsonage behind the church where Reverend Obadiah Stoneleigh lived alone. She told him everything in 5 minutes. Reverend Stoneleigh did not waste time on questions or on pity. He was a small man and he was 60 years old, but he had been a chaplain in the Union Army during the war between the states, and there was iron under his soft white beard. He listened to her story with his pale blue eyes growing harder and harder, and when she had finished, he stood up from his chair and reached for his coat. "Child, Mr. Vexley has made a mistake tonight. He has made the mistake of underestimating a country preacher in a town full of men who are tired of being pushed. You will go to the livery stable and you will tell Henry Clayton to saddle his fastest horse for you. Henry owes the Thornquist brothers a debt that he will never be done paying, and he will give you anything you ask. I will go to the Silver Dollar, and I will speak to certain men who have been waiting a long time for someone to give them a reason. We will meet you at the south end of the street in half an hour. Can you ride?" "I can ride." "Then ride, child. Ride harder than you have ever ridden in your life. We will be behind you. God willing, we will be behind you in time." She rode out of Cottonwood Falls in the last light of the November day on a tall sorrel mare named Gideon that Henry Clayton had pressed into her hands without a single question. The mare had been bred for distance, and Della rode her the way she had been taught to ride by her father long ago on the bridle paths of the Boston Common, with her back straight and her hands soft on the reins and her weight balanced low in the saddle. She rode with her bonnet tied tight against the wind and her honey blonde hair coming loose around her face, and her grandmother's knives jouncing against her hip, and Ezra's mother's journal pressed against her ribs inside her coat. She rode all night. The road through Devil's Pass was the worst part. The moon came up about 3 hours into the ride and turned the snow on either side of the road to a pale silver. but the pass itself was in deep shadow, and the place where Lenora Vance's wagon had gone over the edge 8 years ago was a black emptiness on her right hand that seemed to pull at her like the open mouth of something hungry. She did not look down. She kept her eyes on the small patch of road in front of the mare's hooves, and she rode and she rode, and she prayed under her breath the whole way. Behind her, an hour back along the road, 15 men from Cottonwood Falls were riding in a long, silent line. Reverend Stoneleigh rode at their head. Henry Clayton rode beside him. The other 13 were men who had each in his own way been waiting for a long time to settle a private account with Thaddeus Vexley. She crested the last ridge above Thornquist Ridge in the cold gray hour before dawn, and she saw the smoke. A long, thin column of black smoke was rising from somewhere down in the valley below the great log house. She could see orange light flickering through the windows of the barn. She could hear the high, faint crackle of guns being fired in the dawn stillness. Vexley's men had not waited for daylight after all. They had come up the back trail in the dark, and the fight had already begun. She put her heels into the mare and went down the slope at a run. The yard of Thornquist Ridge, when she reached it, was a scene out of a soldier's nightmare. The barn was burning. The corral fence had been broken in 3 places. 2 strangers' bodies lay in the snow near the porch, and there beside the broken corral gate lying face down in the bloody snow with one of Rourke's bullets between his shoulder blades was the scarred body of Mordecai Bream. He had ridden up the back trail with Vexley's men. He had not made it past the first volley. The man who had reached for Della's elbow in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon 6 weeks before would never reach for any woman again. Rourke Thornquist was firing from a window on the 2nd floor of the house, his rifle muzzle flashing pale in the gray light. Ezra was crouched behind the stone wall of the well, working the lever of his own rifle in long, even strokes, and on the front porch of the house, leaning hard against a post for support, with his bandaged leg dragging beneath him and his old long rifle braced across the porch rail, stood Holden Thornquist. He had taken a bullet through the meat of his left shoulder in the first volley before dawn, but he had refused to go back inside the house while his brothers were still fighting. He was bleeding from the wound, and the blood had soaked the front of his shirt black. His face was the color of bone, but he was on his feet, and he was firing, and as Della came thundering into the yard on the borrowed sorrel mare, he turned his head and saw her, and his face went through a change she would remember for the rest of her days. She came off the mare almost before the animal had stopped moving. She ran to the porch. She came up the steps 2 at a time. She threw her arms around Holden Thornquist's neck, right there in the open, with the bullets singing past the porch posts on either side, and she held him with all the strength she had. Holden Thornquist, I am home." He dropped the rifle and put his good arm around her and pressed his face into the top of her hair, and his big shoulders shook one time, just one time. "Della, you came back." "I never left. I only went down the mountain to find out what I already knew." A new sound rose at the head of the valley behind her, the sound of 15 horses coming hard over the ridge. Reverend Stoneleigh and the men of Cottonwood Falls came down into the yard of Thornquist Ridge in a long, disciplined line, and they came in shooting. The hired guns of Thaddeus Vexley were already exhausted from the climb up the back trail and the long night and the surprise of finding the Thornquist brothers ready for them. The arrival of 15 fresh, angry men from the valley below broke them inside of 10 minutes. 3 of them died in the snow where they had taken cover. The rest threw down their weapons and put up their hands. Rourke Thornquist came down out of the second-story window with his rifle still in his hands and walked among them and took their pistols away, and not one of them met his eyes. Thaddeus Vexley was found 2 miles down the back trail, riding fast for Cottonwood Falls, on the same match bay he had used to come up the mountain 6 weeks before. Rourke ran him down on a fresh horse from the corral. Vexley reached for the pistol in his coat. Rourke shot him cleanly out of the saddle in the gray light of the dawn, and that was the end of Thaddeus Vexley. The papers that were later found in his hotel room in Cottonwood Falls were enough to send the false lawyer Percival Hollister to the territorial prison in Cannon City for 15 years and to expose the railroad bribes that had been quietly buying up half the small ranches in the valley for the last 2 years. By Christmas of 1883, the Denver and Rio Grande had quietly abandoned its plans to lay a spur through the valley at all. The land of Thornquist Ridge was safe. The barn was rebuilt in the second week of December. Half the men of Cottonwood Falls came up the mountain for a barn raising, the like of which had not been seen in the valley in 20 years. They worked from sunup to sundown for 3 straight days. Della and the other women cooked for them all in the great log house, and the smell of fresh bread and roasting venison drifted out into the cold December air, and the sound of hammers and laughter rang from the new pine timbers, and Holden Thornquist sat on the front porch with a quilt across his knees and watched his neighbors raise his barn for him, and he wept once very quietly, with his face turned away so that no one could see. It was on the afternoon of the 18th of December that Holden took her down to the bank of Silver Creek beneath the tallest pine on the property and asked her to be his wife. He went down on one knee in the snow, even though his leg was still not strong enough to bear it. He took his mother's gold ring out of his coat pocket and held it up to her in the slanted gold light of the late afternoon. Adelaide Ashford, I have spent 8 years thinking my heart was dead in the ground. You proved me wrong. You walked into my house with biscuits and a piano and a needle and a thread, and you brought me back from a country I did not know I could come back from. I do not have the words a proper man would have for a moment like this one. I have only this ring and these mountains and 2 brothers who already love you like a sister and a heart that has finally remembered how to beat. If you will take all of that, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it. Will you marry me, Della? She knelt down in the snow with him and put her hand into his. Yes, Holden Thornquist, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her then for the first time very gently, with the snow falling around them and the great pine trees towering above their heads and the western sun setting fire to the high peaks behind him. The kiss was as careful as his hands had been on the day he had first lifted her down from the wagon. It was the kiss of a man who had decided to live again. They were married on Christmas Eve of 1883 in the front room of the great log house at Thornquist Ridge. Reverend Obadiah Stoneley performed the ceremony. Old Hessie McBride sat in the place of honor in a chair Holden had carried in from his own bedroom for her. Ezra played his fiddle. Rourke stood as his brother's witness, and there were tears in the wild brother's eyes that he did not bother to hide. Della wore a simple white dress sewn from linen by Mrs. Hollins of the Cottonwood Falls rooming house, and her mother's cameo brooch was pinned at her throat, and her honey blonde hair was loose around her shoulders, the way Holden had said once very softly that he liked it best. When the ceremony was over and the vows were spoken and the ring was on her hand, Holden bent down and kissed her in front of all the gathered company, and the front room of Thornquist Ridge, filled with the sound of cheering and stamping boots, and Ezra's fiddle striking up a wedding reel, and the great log house at the head of the valley, remembered at long last what it had been built for in the spring of 1847. The years rolled on after that the way years roll on in a good life, which is to say slowly when you are inside them, and very quickly when you look back on them. Lirabeth Hesse Thornquist was born in the late summer of 1884, with her father's whiskey-colored eyes and her mother's honey-blonde hair. Holden held her in his big, calloused hands the night she was born and wept openly. Asa Augustus came in 1885. Wendell Holden came in 1887. By the spring of 1888, there were 3 small Thornquist children running barefoot on the porch of the great log house, and 3 pairs of small muddy boots lined up by the front door. And Della went about her days with flour on her apron and a baby on her hip, and a husband who watched her across every room she entered as if he could not believe his good fortune. Rourke married Cordelia Stoneley, the Reverend's only daughter, in the spring of 1886, and the wild brother grew slowly tame in the way of men who have finally found something worth coming home to. They built a small house of their own a quarter-mile down the valley from the main house, and the cousins all grew up together. Ezra never married, but he became the most beloved music teacher in all the high country, and there was rarely a child in the valley by the late 80s who could not play at least one tune on the fiddle that Ezra Thornquist had taught them. He lived in the great log house with his brother and his brother's wife and his nieces and nephews until the day he died, and he was the favorite uncle of every child who carried the Thornquist name. 20 years passed. It was an afternoon in the late summer of 1903. Della Thornquist, 43 years old now, with the first thin strands of silver in her honey-blonde hair, stood at the railing of the porch of the great log house at Thornquist Ridge and looked out over the valley her husband's father had cut from the wilderness 56 years before. Lirabeth, 19 years old and engaged to be married to the son of Henry Clayton, in the spring came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee in her hands and gave one to her mother. Asa, 18, was learning the blacksmith trade from his uncle Ezra in the forge across the yard. Wendell, 16, had gone hunting at first light with his uncle Rourke and would be home before sundown. Holden Thornquist, 55 years old now, his dark hair gone almost entirely silver, walked with a slight permanent limp that had been with him since the night a bull had put a horn through his thigh in a blizzard 20 years before. He came out onto the porch and lowered himself slowly into the rocking chair beside his wife, and he reached for her hand the way he had reached for it every evening of every year since the night she had set down her stitching needle and told him he would live. They sat together in the long golden afternoon and watched the light moving down the high peaks toward the valley floor. Della, do you remember the day you stepped down from that stagecoach in Cottonwood Falls? I remember it, Holden. I was so frightened I could hardly stand. I was more frightened than you were. I have never told you that, but I was. I know you were. I knew it the moment I looked into your eyes. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles the way he had kissed them every evening for 20 years. The sun went down over the western peaks. The first stars came out above the high valley. From the kitchen behind them came the smell of bread baking and the sound of a child laughing and the soft murmur of women's voices preparing supper. Della Thornquist closed her eyes for one moment and felt the warmth of her husband's hand around her own. The letter had not lied. It had not told the whole truth either, but the whole truth, when it had finally come, had been larger and deeper and more beautiful than anything any letter could have promised. She had walked 3,000 miles in a navy blue traveling dress to find her true home, and she had found it, and she had built it, and it would stand on this mountain long after she and Holden were gone, the way the great log house had stood for 56 years already, and would go on standing for many years to come. The last red light of the western sun touched the railing of the porch and was gone. The first night of the rest of their long, quiet life together began to fall over Thornquist Ridge.